Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Melanie Dizon. I'm the Director of Education and Research at the Davis Phinney Foundation. And today we are here for another edition of the YOPD Council monthly sessions. Hello everybody. We have Kat and Gaynor and Aaron and Amy and Kevin on today. We might have a few more people coming on we will have a couple more people coming on. Today, Kat is going to be our fearless leader in the talk of death and dying and Parkinson's. So this is a tough topic, but it's one that we all think about no matter what's going on in our lives. And I think it's a great thing for everyone to feel like they can weigh in on, and this is a safe space to talk about and ask the questions that you have. And hopefully everyone on this panel will be able to help you out and offer some insights into how they think of things and what they do in their life to make them feel better about the death and dying process. So take it away, Kat.
All right, thanks, Mel. Thanks everybody for joining us today. So I'm going to start off by saying, that I'm not an expert in this area, but I think it's an area, it's a universal experience for all of us. We will all live and we will all pay taxes, probably, and we will all die, right? Nothing is certain but death and taxes. I don't remember who said that, but, and I have had the privilege of being with my mom when she passed. She was involved in hospice care at the end of her life, and my dad also died in hospice care. And so those are my two primary closest experiences. As a nurse and as a nurse practitioner, I of course was exposed and participated and saw death quite often in the hospital, although as a midwife in my later years, I saw less of that. But it doesn't mean that there's not grief and loss around reproductive health. I'm going to pull from a book that I think is really, really valuable, and it is by Atul Gawande, Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters in the End. And I think this is a really well done book. Atul is a palliative care doctor, and he talks about his experience of being a physician and also going through the process of his dad's death and dying. His dad was also a physician, which is interesting. So I was going to kick things off and just read a couple paragraphs that I think summarize well kind of where we are, and then I'm really going to open it up to discussion. He writes, "Modern scientific capability has profoundly altered the course of human life. People live longer and better than at any other time in history. But scientific advances have turned the process of aging and dying into medical experiences, matters to be managed by healthcare professionals. And we in the medical world have proved alarmingly unprepared for it. This reality has been largely hidden, as in the final phases of life become less familiar to people. As recently as 1945, most deaths occurred in the home. By the 1980s, just 17% did. Those who somehow die at home likely died too suddenly to make it to the hospital, say from a massive heart attack, stroke, or violent injury, or were too isolated to get somewhere that could provide help quickly. Across not just the US, but also the entire industrialized world, the experience of advanced aging and death has shifted from hospitals, shifted to hospitals and nursing homes. So on that note, I would like to hear anybody that feels like sharing. And before I dive into some of the content pieces and some of the nuts and bolts of things that you can prepare for. Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
I think that this is one of those topics which, you don't find a lot of glee and joy, but it's one of those things that if you have the conversation now, instead of at the end stage, I think you actually find the antithesis of being doom and gloom, but actually very uplifting. I don't know if others on the panel agree with that.
I definitely agree with that. I am, in my experience with my mom had 3 independent cancers 3 different times over a matter of 22 years. And we had a lot of discussions about what a good death would be like for her. And those were hard conversations to have, especially when I was younger in my 30s. I was better prepared for it in my 40s. But I think that she felt a sense of peace when it was finally her time to pass, because we had talked so much about it. She felt like her wishes would be honored. And I think that that's a really important step that we need to touch on today. And that is, if people have ideas around what they want or don't want done at the end of their life, it's imperative that they write it down and get it documented. And probably everybody's asked when they go to their doctor's appointment, do you have an advance directive, right? We've all heard of those. There's also things like power of attorney for medical decisions. You can actually appoint somebody who can be your decision maker at the end of your life. And obviously, it's really important to have conversations with that person about what you want and don't want. I had power of attorney for both my parents for their medical decisions. My brothers were very happy about that. But we all knew what our parents wanted, and those are actually legal documents that can be shown to providers to help you advocate for the people that you love. So I think it's really important. And as we all age, we're all gonna deal with this. And some of us may be dealing with our parents and grandparents, but someday it will be our turn to deal with this. And we need to think about what we want at the end of life.
Yeah, I was going to add to that, Kat. I think it's an interesting dynamic that we face. So probably a lot of people on the panel and a lot of people in the audience, we're conditioned right away that when you've been diagnosed, it goes through your mind, oh my God, I'm not going to live as long or have a quality of life as everybody else does. But if you look at it from a different perspective, it's kind of, I don't want to say it's a good thing, but the positive in this is that because these things have happened to us, we can have more ownership of our ultimate destiny. So we're thinking about things that I don't want to say typical population probably isn't thinking about until much later in their life, but they don't come up until typically there's a reason for, unless you're just an exorbitant planner, or you've got somebody who in your life has taught you that you should be planning for these things up front. So I think that there's a lot of empowerment in that, and having those conversations and being able to say, this is what I'm thinking about. I still have time to do research on what that means, whether it's I want to donate my body to science. What does that mean? Where does my body end up? Do I want to, go in a mausoleum? Do I want to be cremated? Do I want to be shot into space? You can look through all of the pros and cons and kind of have more, I think, facts going into whatever decision is going to work for you and your family. So it's a unique position, and I do think there is some positive in it.
I think you get into some very interesting issues of culture and upbringing when you start talking about this topic. And we all come from very different backgrounds when we deal with it. In some cases, talking about death is a taboo. And in other cultures, it's actually warmly appreciated. You hear, your grandmother talk about her plans, when she's 60 years old, right? Have this conversation. Kat, you're muted.
Yeah, there we go. I was telling Kev he was cutting in and out. Somebody brought up a really good question over in the side here about wanting to fight the disease and not wanting the plug to be pulled too soon. But don't want to have an extended lie around either. And I think that a lot of us feel that way, and it's all about quality of life, right? So Heather, yeah, I'm gonna let you chime in here, babe. You're muted.
I think Gaynor might have been ahead of me, so I'll let her have her thought first, and then I'll jump in.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I think Erin made a very good point about perspective, and the Parky perspective on death. I think you know, we've dealt with grief and some of the, you know, the normal pathways of grief when you actually get diagnosed. So, I mean, obviously not to the nth degree, but you've kind of dipped your toe in those waters, I think, already. So I think that's kind of helpful in itself. And a lot of people, I think the trigger for a lot of people with young onset Parkinson's tends to be grief or major illness of a loved one. And so grief almost gets them their Parkinson's diagnosis. And then, you know, I'm not conveying this very well, but you get my gist, I think.
You know, I like to take sort of the Japanese samurai view of life. And it ties to the conversation that the last questioner just brought up, that they want to fight. I don't think having a conversation about the end stage and the last moments of your life is a defeat on life. In fact, if anything, you want to live life more fully. And having this conversation actually allows you freedom to kind of liberate yourself to say that I will fight to the very end, but when it's time, I want to go with dignity. And I think that's a really important part with those, but you have to have that conversation at the right time. To have that conversation with a newly diagnosed Parkinson's patient is probably a little too early. But those of us that have lived with it for a decade or more, we start to see other, other turns of this journey, right? I mean, I'm coming off of a particularly difficult last quarter where I lost my brother to cancer. My next door neighbor, who's actually a DPF ambassador's husband, and a good friend of mine died of MS, all within like 3 weeks. And I was able to be at two of those places, one by Zoom and one at the person's bedside, while they were going through this very dignified exit in life. And to me, that I was like, these people get it right. They figured out how to go with dignity. It's no sacrifice on their life. All three of these people live life fully up until the end.
What do they say, Kevin? The only thing to fear is fear itself.
Well, that's right. My brother actually had a saying, I don't fear death, I fear not living well.
I love that. I love that. Heather, you wanted to chime in, love?
I'm just echoing exactly what Kevin was saying. And Kevin, you have been a remarkable inspiration to me during this time of loss and grief and change. So thank you so much for showing by example how to do so with so much grace. I also wanted to say death and taxes, memento mori. And I'm getting memento mori tattooed on my skin to remind me, of course, we're all going to die. We're all just walking each other home, like Ram Dass says. That's my favorite quote of all time. I feel like I've been preparing for this for a lifetime. My grandmother was crippled when I knew her. Two of my grandparents were dying from the time I can remember. I've lost so many friends, and I watched my father die very slowly. And I think it's part of the process. This is why I spend a lot of time focusing on spirit and soul. I'm not proselytizing, I'm not talking about religion, I'm talking about impermanence as a philosophy. Following, for example, the teachings of somebody like, I don't know, Pema Chodron, or someone who talks a lot about impermanence and getting comfortable with that. And then running death cafes at my house too. And I'll talk more about those later, maybe, if we have time. Thanks.
Yeah, I have another quote from the book that I love, that Zen says, you live longer only when you stop trying to live longer. And I liked that. The work of it, the letting go, the surrender.
Kat, I saw
Yeah.
a question in the comments that I wanted to make a comment on, if
Yes,
that's okay.
please.
So Dwight, I think from Wichita. So you were asking if there's a significant difference between people with PD compared to the general population in terms of death and dying. And I'm only going to answer this for myself, and others can chime in. For me specifically, I don't think it's different than other people, but what I notice is from day to day, week to week, month to month, I can feel my body changing. I can feel the disease progressing. I don't want to say progressing, but different aches and pains, and things are becoming a little bit more challenging than they used to. And it's just because I can feel it I don't want to say getting worse, because that might not necessarily be the right term, but I can feel it affecting my body and my day-to-day activities and my overall well-being as a person. It does cross your mind, because then you say, okay, so now I have this new tick or this new ache, this new pain. Does this mean I'm progressing? Does this not mean I'm progressing? Is it a reaction to my medication? Is it a reaction to something else? So your mind kind of can be your own worst enemy, at least where I'm concerned, where the disease does start to progress and you kind of get into that pitfall of, okay, am I advancing faster than I anticipated? Am I not? What's really causing this? So it's kind of, you have to figure out when to stop that mental mind game and figure out, you can focus on what's wrong and what's not working, or figure out how to pick yourself up and find a new way to work through it, and realize that it might not be the disease, it might be the disease, but I'm only 44, so I can either dwell on it or kind of move on. But I do think it's something that at least I think about as my days go on, and work becomes a little bit more challenging, and typing's become an issue lately. Things just creeping up that weren't there day one. So that's just my 2 cents on it. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add, but
I think so much of what we talk about here comes down to choice, right? And where you put your mind, and what's the saying? Life is happening while you're busy worrying about something else. And so, life itself is progressive and degenerative. And those of us that have a diagnosis have an opportunity sometimes to reflect, and it feels sometimes a little bit more like we've talked about, the grief and loss that go with having a progressive disease that is sort of incremental. As our bodies don't work the way they used to, we are grieving in that. But I think being stuck in grief can mean losing out on living. Once you've grieved, you have a choice to move on from there and come to the living part. And I think for many, especially at the end of life, being able to say and discuss with people that with your loved ones what your desires are, make it easier to be more in the moment as you live those last few weeks, months, years of your life, because you've been able to grab a hold of it and share what you want. And I loved it. Kevin, you had a thought, and then I'd love to hear about the death cafes too. So I'm going to mute here. Go ahead, Kev.
Yeah, have any of you been to a palliative care Parkinson's specialist? I went there for the first time in December for my first one. And it's a completely different appointment than going to see your regular Parkinson's traditional neurologist. Instead of doing a UPDRS assessment on that moment in time, the first conversation is almost like a 2-hour conversation on values. Where do you want to be? Where do you want to go? And I have to say that was probably one of the more refreshing, rewarding 2 hours that I've spent. I mean, we ended up filling out a form. And every state's different, but we fill out this really hideous lime green form, which goes in my medical chart, which is basically, they use the term advanced directives. But what was, for me, the conversation was, initially it was, I don't want to be a DNR, do not resuscitate. I mean, I want to be a DNR, do not resuscitate me. But in going through the conversation, it was actually really meaningful to really tease what DNR really means, and is that really what you want? I saw a comment from one of the attendees that they want to fight. And I'm the same way. I will fight to the very end. And I was thinking to myself, if I got in a car accident, I'd want someone to try to resuscitate me for sure. But what I don't want to be is a vegetable, with my DVS pulled out and just paralyzed on life support system. That's a very different living. And so we went into the conversation and filled it out according to my directives. And I think every state is different. So this form in Colorado is called the MOSE form. But I'm told that various states have different rules and laws about advance directives. She even used the term assisted suicide, which is kind of a very negative term for most of us. But we kind of know the gist. Some countries, and I'm really curious, Gaynor, for you in the UK, what's it like? Because it's difficult to get assistance. You're better off having a dog and putting your dog down than you are your loved one.
Just checking he wasn't underneath my desk then. No, you're right. It's a very, I know it's a contentious issue wherever, but because we've had cases, serial killers, for example, there was a case with Harold Shipman, he put the cause back so much further. I think there's an awful lot of people that would like it properly addressed, would like the option. But we have to work out how to go to Dignitas in Switzerland. That's usually the kind of way around it. But there's something about if you address death as someone with a chronic condition, then you're kind of free to get on with life, aren't you? Which is the point, really, isn't it? Deal with it and then get on with every day.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Amy, you had something.
Really quick, and then I want to hear about Heather's Death Cafes too. But to Gaynor's point and everybody else's point too, I wrote about this in one of the blog posts I wrote for Davis Phinney. But right after I was diagnosed, a woman who I know, who we walk our dogs together sometimes in our neighborhood. I told her, and her response was, "What a gift you've just been given," which sounds kind of offensive to some people, but I understood her question. She had just nursed her mother through Alzheimer's and buried her. And what she said was, "What a gift you've just been given. You've just had the veil lifted." And not many people have that opportunity to understand how precious your life is right now, right this second, and your relationships. And so that was really eye-opening for me. I loved her response, and it came from a place of real experience and authenticity, which goes to, Kat, what you said. I think a lot of it depends on where you put your mind. And also a lot of it depends on these kinds of conversations. And again, waiting for the death cafes, but I think that these kinds of conversations are really hard to have with your family first, and trying to figure out what words to use and what you want it's really good to talk it through with other people, maybe palliative care practitioner, or just, in a death cafe or something, before you talk about it with your family. So you're good with the words and the linguistics that you're going to use.
Yeah. And Heather, I'm just going to cut your death cafe off one more second, because I just wanted to talk about what Amy said. So one of the most fascinating things was a couple of years ago, we did a Victory Summit event in Seattle. And we were kind of going back and forth about what movement breakout sessions to have. And one of them was a woman who specializes in advanced directives. And we were like, is this something that people, is it something we want to have at the Victory Summit? Is this the right place for it? We ended up having it, and it ended up actually, everyone kind of went in there feeling like, how are we how is this going to go? Is this going to be really upsetting? And it ended up being one of the most like uplifting sessions of the day. And the woman, well, she was a fabulous speaker, first of all, but second of all, she really helped on that aspect, Amy. She said, you know, one of the things that you could do is when you're going to have we were coming up on the holidays. So she was like, at Thanksgiving dinner, you know, pass this sheet around. And she gave us this sheet. And it was basically, she would ask everybody in the audience a question, and then you would say thumbs up or thumbs down. And everybody was looking at each other thinking, oh, I didn't know you would answer it that way. I thought you would answer it this way. But it wasn't really severe and heavy. It was just, oh, it opened up the door to those questions. And I think that was a really interesting way of presenting it. Lee put the link up to when I talked about that, I wrote about that experience. But I think that's such a great point to bring it up, is just, you know, get comfortable with the language, and your people are going to mirror your attitude and your vibe with it. Right. So if you go in there and think, this is okay, everybody, this is what I want to talk about, it's super important to me, they're going to look at you differently than if you go in and this real heavy and like, oh my gosh, I can't deal with it. So, all right, Death Cafe, you're on.
Thanks, Mel. All right, Heather.
So the Death Cafe is not about grieving, and it's not necessarily therapeutic. It's to help people deal with their finite lives and make sense and purpose of things, and just to share. So it's a guided, not-for-profit meeting that you organize in a community in a very personal and private space. It can be held in a cafeteria, as the Swiss sociologist used to do. I think his name was Bertrand Crottat or something like that. Bertrand Crottat, I don't know how to pronounce it. And he started these cafes because he wanted someplace where it could be spoken of and he wouldn't be sort of accosted as get over it or get past your grief. You know, people, when you bring up uncomfortable emotions with people such as trauma or grief, a lot of people are uncomfortable for a number of reasons. Maybe they want to rush you along, and grief doesn't have a timeline, obviously. And, you know, none of it does. Nobody can tell us what our timeline is. So it's nice to join in with a community of trusted souls. You know, it's a little bit like AA, I imagine, where you just join, but there's no donation or anything. Usually it's tea and cake. You meet in the cafe, you talk about your experiences with death, and therefore you have greater purpose to live longer. Because those of us who, whether we've watched someone die or whether we were young and we saw that open casket with our big, strong friend, you know, our friend's big, strong dad in the casket, thinking, how could this be? This fragile body, you know, this disillusionment that you have all mentioned of being mortal and finite as we all are is pretty extreme sometimes. So the death cafes are wonderful. And I've been doing this for years at my home, around my dining room table. So, you know, everyone's invited to join, of course.
We'll have to have it virtually, Heather, a virtual death cafe. I think death cafes can be a great tool to help you get comfortable with the language, but also learn about purpose and maybe how you want your own death or end of life to look, what you want it to look like, and hear about others' experiences. I think it can broaden your world and maybe help give you the language. Heather, to even have the discussions with your own family. I wanted to touch on something that Kevin talked about, and that was seeing a palliative care specialist or a palliative care neurologist, you saw, right? So everybody thinks of palliative care as like end of life. It really is not about end of life anymore. We're trying to change. When I say we, I mean those of us that are thinking about these things, and in the medical field, we want people to be thinking about palliative care as quality of life. The doctor was having discussions with Kevin about what he wanted, what his philosophy was, what his ethics. I'm putting words in your mouth, Kev, but those are things that we should, can, ought to, might want to think about as we are living. And so palliative care can help us navigate and define how we want to live. and live fully. It's not just about navigating the end of life. And at the World Parkinson Congress, there's going to be some content around this specifically and trying to broaden how we all view palliative care. And I think it can be a tool that maybe we should access sooner, especially if we're not sure about what we want. It may help us clarify what we want. And there's mental health care providers that can help us do some of that processing too. But I'd love to see us accessing more of those tools sooner. And I'd love to hear a little bit more, Kev, about your experience too, if you're comfortable sharing.
You're muted, Kev, and we can't hear you.
Kevin, you're muted.
So on the form that I filled out, it deals directly with quality of life, Kat. So you were right on about that. It says, I just don't want prolonged life support if there's no chance of returning to a quality of life state. Now that's a pretty ambiguous, broad thing that you can drive a truck through, but at least it sort of gave me peace of mind that in the experience. And then we went on to talk about, you know, in this country or in Colorado, how you would actually go about ending life. So it was a really, in my mind, not at all a doom and gloom conversation, but it was truly one of those, it was one of the better appointments that I've ever been to, actually. And I encourage everyone to go see a palliative. I'm not saying that that's your only point of contact, but what it does is it looks at instead of a snapshot of where you are UPDS, you know, on February 15th, what it looks at is the continuum of care and takes a team approach on maybe you need to speak to so-and-so, you know, in our physical therapy department or a sleep lab or in our GI clinic, but they sort of act like what's the right word? Like a foreman in your healthcare. Now it's only been my first appointment, so I don't know where it's going, but at least my first appointment was very positive.
I have a very concrete question about that, and that is, are they covered by insurance?
Well, I haven't gotten the bill yet, so I hope
right?
so.
I mean, like, do you need a referral? And if so, like, what's the criteria for that? And I never thought about that before, but I have to look into that.
In this particular case, my traditional DBS neurologist said, would you like an appointment? I can give you a referral. I encourage you to go see, you know, the palliative care. And they rotate and they cross cover each other. So I think I'm covered, but it's a very good question.
It's a great question. And it's and palliative care too. So I think, Amy, that brings up a very, very good point. And I think in my experience, it required a referral for my dad. And he was not billed. He was on, it was paid for by Medicare. Now he was in California, so it may vary, but I think it's important to ask that question. But I also want to clarify too a little bit that palliative care is not the same thing as hospice either.
No.
I think those are different terms and used. Palliative care can be about quality of life and living and continuing to pursue treatment and incorporate all of those pieces. Hospice is usually invited in when somebody has decided not to continue to pursue active treatment of disease. And I think that's just a distinction I wanted to make. Let's see, I have two hands. A Gaynor, it's all yours.
I think one of the other things that we need to consider is if we don't process this and we don't address it for ourselves, it might suddenly land in the lap of our carer, significant other, or, you know, it needs to be our decision and we need to make our wishes clear, I think. I mean, I've been in this situation where My best friend, I was living with him, and he died of cancer, and I was watching him as his cancer progressed, and there were times where he seemed quite, if he seemed positive, it seemed like that's the opportunity for me to ask an awkward question. But then, of course, you've really depressed me now. Right, but I can't ask you the question when you're depressed. And trying to actually say, what do you want? What do you, what do you want me to do when push comes to shove? That's the wrong phrase, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Gaynor. If we don't make the decisions for ourselves, somebody else will make them for us. Heather, you were up, and then Kev.
I just wanted to add that many people make the mistake of thinking that hospice is a business, like instead of a program. So the hospice range can vary greatly depending on what nurse you get and where they registered, how they registered, and in what form they registered. It's about as different as if you were going to get married and you wanted to choose someone to marry you, So it's within the same program. They have to be obviously, they get qualified, but it's just, hospice is not a catch-all for everything too. So
and you can interview hospice and talk to hospice before you're ready for them. We did that with my mom and went through the process and asked the questions, when should we call you? And we asked, and it was all lined up. My mom was actually only in hospice for 3 days, but we had talked to them sometime in advance. Kevin, yeah, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just noticing that Gaynor has a glass of wine and I'm jealous.
It's late in the day in the UK.
Yeah.
Kevin, you will notice I always have a glass of wine.
Oh, so
and it is late.
Good for you for being on late. I'm always really curious, and I'd love to get the panel view on this. The statement that I brought this up with my palliative care neurologist. I personally hate the term that you don't die from Parkinson's, you die with it. And she said the exact same thing. She goes, that's a horrible definition because it does a disservice to those of us who are trying to live and be around and charting our course, right? And she said, no, death definitely does occur with Parkinson's, or secondarily, it can cause some other complication that might end up, but that doesn't mean it's not that you want to labor over, will I die from Parkinson's, but just being able to acknowledge that this is something that will eventually end in a way that how you handle it is, to me, really important. So go ahead, Kat.
Yeah, I have, my dad died. My dad qualified for hospice care with a Parkinson's diagnosis. He died probably from pneumonia secondary to aspiration. However, his death certificate said he died from Parkinson's. So I take offense with that issue too. Now, having said that, I also could easily get hit by a bus and that could take me out. But I think that we need to be careful about how we effuse those cute little sayings that none of us seem to like. Gaynor, how about you, babe?
Well, also it's interesting that we don't die of Parkinson's, we die with it, and yet the figures from the World Health Organization would appear to say otherwise. It's all a little bit, I don't know, is this for the benefit of insurance companies? Because is it a different deal if it's a terminal diagnosis compared to a chronic diagnosis? Just saying.
I think you would have to know who runs the world. And I think that right now, insurance companies, I think, are running the world a bit. So anyway, I'm sorry, Erin.
That's okay. I just have a question for the panel. It's something that I've not yet experienced myself, so I'm going to throw it out there. How do you incorporate this piece of the puzzle into your care plan for Parkinson's? Is it something that you've defined once and put it away? Is it something that you bring up, once a year and kind of revisit and see, has my thought process changed? Have my plans changed? Have my values changed? Or is it something that's just, for the most of us, one and done, and you just put it away and don't think about it again?
Cab, you want to take that one?
So what they told me is that this document is not etched in stone. You can change it anytime. You can change it verbally. So it's not a binding contract. And I think that gave me a little bit of relief as well, because I didn't want to sign something that says, oh no, I'm going down this path, right? So to answer your question, Aaron, again, state by state might have different laws, but I'm thinking that the more progressive states, they're not going to hold you to it if you change your mind.
I know that we recently put together our trust and all of our documentation, and partly after reading the book, the Being Mortal book, because I think we wanted our kids to have a sense of what we want at the end of life and have paperwork filled out. I believe strongly that part of living is, at least for my family, trying to model living, and also the hard parts, which will be end of life also. And I think having those conversations and making them more normalized. Now, we're a family that's been talking about birth control at the table since my kids were in kindergarten. So we've had some practice doing that, but I think those are important things to start thinking about if you have strong feelings about it. Cab. Kevin, you have your hand up. Do you have?
Oh, I'm sorry, that was an old one.
Oh, okay.
No, let me take it back off.
It's an interesting mix, isn't it? Because it's spiritual, it's philosophical, it's really concrete, legal and financial discussions. Cultural. And some of it you need outside people to help you with, and some of it has to be completely internal.
Mm-hmm.
And most of it has to be shared with your loved ones. So it's really hard to know how to approach it, how to start it, because it has so many moving parts.
Yeah, I would think one of the things that that other session was really helpful was they actually asked, we probably had 50 people in the room, and they said, how many people know who the first person is that would be responsible for you if you didn't write it down? And everybody got the first and second people right. After that, they got them wrong, and they were like just devastated to find out who might have been in that line legally. And so that's something to just really think about when you're looking at your papers. Look for your state and have it say, like, what's the order? For some people in that room, they said the fact that I found out that this person was going to have a say is the thing that made me take action and make sure that my paperwork was in order. It doesn't seem like a big thing, but it ends up being a big deal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. It's somewhat about getting affairs in order, I think. And I think for me, having those in order gives me peace of mind, and I can get back on with the living. And so I don't know whether we really answered your question, Aaron. I think that we will revisit it from time to time. I honestly don't expect a lot of it to change. It will change as we get older and hopefully live very long lives. And it depends too, if we move out of state, if, all those things, but. Yeah, Gaynor.
And why wouldn't you want to organise your own funeral? The ultimate party, surely, isn't it?
Right. My mom wrote a poem that she wanted read at her. She did not want a funeral. She was cremated, and we had a kind of a private family ceremony, and I read her poem, and that's what she wanted. She didn't want a lot of falderall, and she didn't want a lot of tears, but it was special, and it was helpful to have closure. for a lot of us. It's been hard, I think, with COVID, people losing loved ones in terms of how they're able to honor and the things that we count on so much for grieving and coming together and celebrating life has been difficult. And I think that in the end of life, I hope to be celebrating a lot. Kevin, yeah.
Yeah, I've termed a new word. It's called Zoom eulogy or zoology.
Zoology. Yeah. I think I also, so I can't help but do this because, as many of you know, I was a midwife for many years and helped bring over 800 babies into the world. And I've had the honor of being with many people, several people at death. And really, those transitions have so much in common. They're big, they're powerful, they're messy, they're intense, and and they're very personal. And they can be really beautiful and really peaceful. And I think that's what I'd want my kids to know, that I'm not terrified of it, and that it's been a privilege for me to be able to attend people both at birth and at death. And yeah, Kev.
You know, I had a friend who used to be a critical care pulmonologist. And I used to always say to him, how do you deal with death? Every patient you see dies, right? And he said, come with me. And he pulled me into his back private office. And he showed me it was just a room decorated with thank you cards from family members. He says, I don't deal with death. I deal with another stage of life.
It really is an honor to be present for people in those moments and those intense moments, and they can be beautiful. Okay, good. There's some hands because I'm tired of hearing me. Go ahead, Heather.
I was just going to say that it's one of the last things to go, or so I hear, happens to be hearing. And it was such an honor. You're right, Kat. I'm going to echo you here, to be with my father. And I'll share something intensely personal because I believe that death itself is not so personal. One of the last things I said to my dad was, you have been such a great father. I've learned so much. We will take care of Mom, I promise. If you want to go, we'll be here with you. And if you're not ready, do what you got to do, Dad. I love you so much. And I think that if we all had the opportunity to do that with each other, we hear a lot of things about eulogies and the aftermath, and we say these beautiful things about people. I want to hear it now, and I want to tell you now so that I don't miss that chance. And I can come off a bit much. People will be like, why are you telling me you love me 7 times a day? And I'm like, just because. I want to make sure the last thing that I say to somebody isn't rough, because I've done that before too. So yeah.
That's beautiful, Heather. Thank you. Yeah, I see hands. Gaynor and then Aaron.
There's definitely something about giving people permission. Sometimes it's I did that with my friend, my best friend with the 7 years of cancer. I saw him in the hospital, and you're right that that they can hear, and it was so painful to watch him and to just say, it's okay, Johnny, you don't have to keep fighting, let it go if you need to. They just need the permission sometimes. And that's what I think it's what you would want someone to say to you, probably, hopefully. And the other thing was, what was I going to say? Oh, I'll have to come back to you. I've lost it. No, can't remember.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add, Kat, I think one topic that we haven't touched on yet is care partners. So especially with young onset Parkinson's, getting these plans together and everything, I would assume some people, much like myself, have had friction with their care partners where they don't want to talk about it, because being diagnosed, it not only impacts your life, but it impacts the plans that they've had, and what they were expecting to live a long, prosperous life. And they need to go through their own processing of what's going on as well. So I'm just interested for the team, if you've had experience dealing with talking about these things and having any friction with care partners, and how you've kind of worked through some of that, if it's happened to you, or even anybody in the audience.
I have some very, very strong feelings about what I don't want him to do. And so we've had some discussions about ways that we can be creative to get those needs met, but by him not doing it. I'm a little stubborn. Kev, over to you.
No, I would agree with Aaron that it's a difficult conversation, and probably ended up in my first divorce in some ways indirectly, because it was such a barrier, this idea that I don't want to be taken care of and pushed around in a wheelchair and spoon fed. And I think it sort of chased away my partner back then, because her comment was, "That's my choice, not yours." Right, in there. So I thought that was an interesting learning. But in the few minutes so that we have left, I did want to bring up one thing that was kind of my observation when Gene passed away last month from Parkinson's. And what he did was, I was at his bedside holding his hand, as he was in his last hours. And what I noticed with the family was, he decided that he was controlling his life all throughout his 77 years. But at the very end, he did something that I thought was really, that gave the whole family pride, was he donated his brain to science afterwards. And it's something that's a really complicated conversation to have with someone when they're in their late stages. And you have to harvest your brain within 48 hours when you pass. So it's really something that you want to take care of before when we're in the stage of planning our advanced directives, if it's something you desire. But to me, the family, when I went to the memorial service, was saying, even in the end, he wanted to benefit the tribe.
Amy, go ahead.
Yeah, real quick. My father had what I would characterize as a good death, in the sense that he went very quickly from a condition that he had had several years before. And he had a really great day with his grandchildren and with his model airplane flying buddies. And he was sitting in his favorite chair with my mom, just futzing around. And a blood clot got loose and stopped his heart. Way before we wanted it to. But what I learned later is that he knew that something was wrong, and he didn't tell anybody on purpose. And to me, that gave me a lot of comfort, because to me, that meant he had some agency over what was happening to him at the end. And as hard as it is in those circumstances, that particular piece of knowledge just made me feel really good. It still does. And I think what we're talking about here, all of it, is about having a little bit of agency over what happens at the end. And not just for ourselves, but for our loved ones, because if they know that we've had a little bit of control, it's so much easier on them. It is for me anyway.
Yeah, that's really well stated, Amy. Thank you. Kevin, you have something to add?
No, again, I forgot to lower my hand.
Also, we had somebody, someone asked about different locations to donate your brain. We just did a post about it, actually, about him donating his brain. So you can check out there, and there are 6 different places across the country. So definitely check it out if you.
Great. I'm not sure if they're going to want mine. That's the part. Is it?
They most definitely want yours.
Is it egotistical to think they'd want it? I don't know.
Totally fine. You have an in-demand brain.
All right, we have a couple of minutes before we wrap up. Does anybody have any last pearls of wisdom to share? I hope this conversation has not been as difficult as we all thought it might be, including me. And I think I feel excited that there are providers out there that are willing to have discussions with us around this. I feel excited that there are homes like Heather's where we can sit around a table eventually and have cake and tea and have hard conversations. And I feel grateful to Davis Phinney for giving us the opportunity to come on today and talk about it. And again, next year, I'd like to choose different topics.
We all seem to be smiling though, Kat.
Yeah,
no one's sobbing and rocking in a corner or
That's because you have your wine.
I do. I am ever so drunk now. Yeah.
I'm rocking, but it's from dyskinesias.
Yeah. Rocking
You're
out.
always rocking, sweetheart.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you everybody for giving us your time today. And as always, thank you to all of my friends and panelists and for getting us through this discussion.